All right, this is part 2 of my Egalitarian Dipshit Talks About Race video. I know I made part 1 months and months ago, and believe it or not, this is actually the 6th time I've started making this video, and each time scrapped it because I didn't like how it turned out. I left out important points, whatever reasons. Usually that's an indication that the topic material is something that I don't give a fuck about anymore, and this race issue happens to be one of them. I think it's an important issue, but I just don't care. I'd rather make creationist videos, to be perfectly honest with you. But I'm going to power through this. So the point of all of that is I'm just going to call this one good enough, and I don't give a fuck if it sucks at all. So I'm giving you a pre-warning. You can stop watching now. I'd highly recommend that anyways. This is going to be long and probably boring. But anyway. So part 1. I made part 1 of this video and I was attempting in that to be somewhat, I wanted to establish maybe a dialogue with some of the more academically inclined race realists, and maybe get into a back and forth reasonable discussion. I've kind of given up that. I realize now that was a pretty naive and kind of a stupid thing on my part, because looking at comments I got on that video, looking at a couple PMs I've gotten from none of the more prominent people, but a few PMs here and there and such, as well as looking at comments and responses to other videos on the topic, is showing me that basically it's a pointless endeavor. The chances are, people that are on the race realist side are gonna see this video title, downrate it, and leave and not watch it, or whatever. If they do watch it, they're not gonna like it anyways. People that are on the egalitarian side are going to like it or not, whatever. It just doesn't matter. It's kind of a waste of my time to try. I don't know. See, I'm telling you. See, that's what I'm talking about. This is going to suck. But I wanted to get into a couple of points. There was a few things that I didn't get into the first video, and I was planning on making part 2 right away, but I don't know if I mentioned it in that one or not, but my mother died right at the time that video was finished, and I had to deal with that shit. I had to deal with going back out in the field for 3 months, just a bunch of shit happening, and I didn't have the energy or time to make another part. Sorry. So anyway, that being said, so one of the things I want to address is there is seems to be a belief amongst the race realist group that the egalitarian stance is that humans left Africa and diversified into these geographically isolated regions, and yet somehow, completely by coincidence or by whatever, our brains remained identical, and even though our bodies changed, or evolution stopped at the neck up or whatever. And first of all, I don't know of any egalitarian that believes that to be true. If they do, they're incorrect. I don't think anybody says that. The minds are under selection, brains are under selection, and it's entirely possible that conditions exist or existed that would have favored differing types of intelligences or lesser or greater intelligences. But because that could have happened doesn't mean that it did. And I want to explain why I think that that's consistent with evolution. Now, I was looking through some of my old PowerPoints. I taught a class called Introduction to Selection Theory, which was an evolution class. I also taught Introduction to Human Evolution, but that's I'm not going to get into that one. This Intro to Selection Theory, I did a lecture in that class on how a beneficial mutation can spread through a population, while leaving within a single population can leave the phenotype of subpopulations or subgroups intact, meaning that a beneficial trait can spread while not really affecting the overall appearance or other characteristics that have selective pressure acting on them. And I took that. I was going to present part of that lecture, and then I looked at it, and I thought I could make some changes, and then I ended up just redoing that whole section a little bit. I'm using the same topic, which was disease resistance instead of intelligence, because I think people are less emotionally attached to disease resistance, and I think that conceptually it kind of makes a lot more sense. It's easier to understand. So I'm going to give that presentation now, and then I'm going to explain how it relates. All right. Let's imagine a species of gazelle that in one particular area has two distinct variants. One lives in the open grasslands and has a uniform tawny coloration and a significantly larger body size. The other lives in a densely forested area and has a darker coloration with stripes and a small body size and smaller horns. We will call these variants D sub SV for savanna and D sub FS for forest. We might at first glance believe that these represent different populations or even subspecies. However, it is discovered that on the boundary of their habitats there exists morphs in between the two types and that limited gene flow occurs. Because of this, DSV and DFS are considered subpopulations within the same population. Now, to add a little more complexity to the scenario, we find that across a very large river there exists another population, and that group is the pool, the ancestral population from which our two subpopulations are derived. Let's call this population P1 for parent population. Because conditions allow for mixing between our daughter and parent populations very rarely, less than once per 50 generations, they are considered separate populations. As a probably irrelevant aside, let's also imagine that early researchers believed that the daughter populations derived from a single colonization event, then subsequently diverged into our savanna and forest groups. However, better resolution of the population genetics revealed that our forest subpopulation is derived from an earlier colonization event, and that later another colonization event led to our savanna group. However complex the origins, the fact remains that because of gene flow, the two groups now represent a single variable population. Now that we've set up this happy little scenario, let's mess it up. About 100 years ago, humans entered this part of the world and brought with them cattle. Now these cattle carried a common virus that is relatively harmless to them, but fatal to our gazelles. This disease kills off over half of our savanna and forest gazelles and causes the functional extinction of the parent population. However, just in the nick of time, a mutation arises in the DSV population that confers immunity to the cattle disease. Because of the mixing of the two subpopulations, the mutation not only spreads quickly through the savanna group, but also through the forest group until both groups are homozygous for the immunity allele, represented here by a pink spot labeled IM. Because the selective pressures affecting other characters have remained constant, we see no other changes in the phenotypes, i.e. the forest gazelles look just like the forest gazelles, etc. Zooming out, we see that relics of the parent population still persist. However, because of the presence of cattle, their original territory cannot be regained. In this scenario, a colonization by the daughter population would be successful. Looking to the east, we find that another population exists, and that this population also has immunity to the cattle disease. However, this immunity is completely independently derived. This one is also homozygous in that population and is indicated by a blue spot labeled IN. Because of the human endeavors, these two populations now have opportunity to mix more frequently than in the past. Say, irrigation shrinks the size of a dividing river. Now we get to the really interesting bit. If the two immunities differ qualitatively, then we would expect that whichever is the most advantageous would become the dominant form of immunity seen. If the two immunities are really equal, then the end result would be some equilibrium state. It wouldn't matter which allele for immunity was carried, provided one was present. Because of random factors, one or the other might just go extinct, or both might persist. So what does this have to do with intelligence? Now I'm going to talk about a couple of different concepts in modern human evolution here. Now, like lots of concepts, lots of these ideas, there are people who don't agree with all of them, or there are differing opinions, different viewpoints, but I don't think any of those change my central point. So if I'm leaving out some details or excluding alternative hypotheses, whatever, I don't think that any of those are changing my point. But Sorry. First of all, it's become pretty clear that starting well over 1 million years ago, humans started leaving Africa. Not modern humans, but humans started leaving Africa and seemed to do so fairly continuously up until, well, forever, up until now. Humans were evolving, adapting, leaving Africa. Those that left Africa were adapting and evolving to local conditions, and then subsequently replaced, either bred out of existence, killed off. We don't know how that worked exactly. We know that there was some interbreeding, at least with some of the later groups that left, but we don't know the entire history. We don't have a genetic history from then, but I suspect if we did, it would be really fascinating. But humans left Africa in these successive waves. I almost think of it as upgrades. The humans that left Africa, and then as a new improved human left Africa, they brought with them the bigger brains, the better adaptability, whatever these things may be, whatever the improvements happen to be, and like again, possibly interbreeding with humans that left earlier, but that's only known for a very, very few of the archaic human groups. But what we do know, and this is interesting to me, is that anatomically modern humans seem to predate anatomically modern human behavior. Now, obviously, behavior doesn't fossilize. There's probably a whole lot more complexity to the story than we know. But we know that about 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans left Africa. Then we also know that I believe it was about 75,000 years ago, possibly earlier if the South African material, I don't know how that's been received, but it doesn't matter. The time isn't that important to what I'm trying to point out here. In East Africa, modern humans started doing something different that they hadn't done before, which is engaging in long-distance trade, beadwork, musical instruments, projectile weapons, fishing. A whole bunch of these behaviors seem to suddenly appear. They may not. They may have, again, there's a continuity theory that states that these changes were occurring slowly, that it wasn't a revolution. They call it the Neolithic Revolution, I believe, the mind's Big Bang, the human spark. There's a number of different names for it. Behavioral modernity. But it appears to have occurred in Africa about 75,000 years ago. By 50,000 years ago, every known modern human group on the planet was engaging in these behaviors, seemingly replacing the old behaviors. Toolkits were replaced by new toolkits. And what was unique about this, and I think this is really a substantial, what seems to imply that there was a brain change that's not going to fossilize, is the fact that what we see is previous humans had a toolkit that evolved slowly over time. We see changes in the toolkit, but we see the same tools being used for a wide variety of different things, if that makes sense. Meaning a tool style remained constant, even though the tool was being used in the desert or used in a temperate climate, whatever. And with this behavioral modernity, we see unique toolkits being used. We see, if based on the climate they're living, we see every different human group suddenly has a wide variety of different tools, and those tools don't remain constant for very long. They change rapidly, probably reflecting changes in climate, exploiting of new food sources and such. We see beads. We see shell beads being traded from thousands of miles away. We see these kinds of things that we didn't see before. Now, again, they may have existed, but this seems to be a revolution in the sense that all humans were doing it. And when humans left Africa with this new improved, whether it's an organic change or a cultural change, whatever it happened to be, and they seem to have spread it to all other human groups. Now, whether they killed off and replaced those human groups, whether they interbred and brought this new characteristic so that the descendants of the archaic human groups now start behaving like modern humans with the new change. Whatever it happens to be, it's irrelevant. But the point is, we see it. So I look at that like the disease resistance in my gazelles that I talked about. That this human brain improvement. Now I'm going to get into a little bit about there's a race libertarian realist brought up a point about that there may be selection pressure against intelligence in some human groups, or there may have been. I'm going to get into that, but I'm just talking about how that would spread. Behavioral, this new improved humans 2.0 that left Africa 50,000 years ago. They were that seems to be worldwide. So I think there's a strong case to be made based on that kind of evidence that what defines a modern Homo sapiens sapiens was present in all known human populations, all known human groups at that time. So if that makes sense. Now let's get into this. Now it's a valid point that libertarian realists brought up. If modern humans with these big complex brains left Africa and say they moved into, I don't know, somewhere, some isolated group, where they could have, maybe the selection pressure to maintain it wasn't there. Maybe the groups that didn't leave Africa descended. Maybe everybody that was smart left. Maybe whatever it happens to be, leaving pressure against intelligence in that group. And the argument has been made that, well, look at the IQ gap, worldwide IQ gap, or whatever it is, this unchanging thing. Which again, that itself could be shown to be incorrect, but that's a different thing. I'm not going to get into that. And saying, see, this is proof of that, or this is evidence of that. And I'm going to say this is what I wasn't going to do when I was talked about not doing in part 1, which was doing the creationist comparison. But I can't help but make that comparison in this case, because it's picking one thing. It's looking at this. Here's this piece of evidence, and then using it to support this idea. When in reality, if it were true, there would be a lot more evidence than just that. And I'm going to get into some of that evidence. What I'm trying to say is it's just like if you listen to creationist speakers talking about Noah's flood, they often will talk about, fossils form more readily in water. Fossils are found worldwide, therefore there was a global flood, ignoring all of the nuances in geology that show us that a worldwide global flood couldn't have happened. Likewise, looking at a piece of evidence like an IQ gap and saying this is proof that humans geographically differentiated and some lost or never acquired a highly intelligent brain, you're taking one piece of evidence and ignoring the other signatures of that event that we would have with us today had it occurred. Hopefully that made sense. So what of that? What would we see today? Let's rewind the human history and restart it again, and let's imagine a group of humans that somehow just never acquired this human spark, or acquired it and then subsequently lost it because their environment didn't favor it. What would that group look like? What would we expect to see? Now, would we expect to see an IQ gap in their descendants today? Yeah, probably. That would be a piece of evidence for such an event occurring. But what else would we expect to see? And that's what I want to get into. Now, if you're familiar with the whole concept of intelligence, IQ, I hate to do this, but I'm going to use this conceptualization, like Rushton used this G, what makes an intelligent person versus an less intelligent person or an unintelligent person. Okay, what is that? Ignoring all of the details and testing and all of that. I'm just going to get into, we all know somebody we think is smart in our lives. We all know people we think are really stupid in our lives, right? Whatever that is. One of the characteristics that defines intelligence is language, right? A good part of our brain is dedicated to language. It's a uniquely human characteristic, complex language. We seem to have a hardwired need to acquire a language. There's been a number of studies looking at that unlike other species, when deprived of a language, we make up our own. whether it be, I mean, through the studies in deaf children and such. Like sign language seems to evolve on its own, a type of sign language. All of it. So we have this capability. Language is a really important part of what makes us human, and within being human, within that category of humanness, there's intelligent people have a larger vocabulary, have a more accurate vocabulary, a more higher concept of the meanings between different similar type words, degrees of concepts of the abstract, this kind of thing, right? If that makes sense. No, I'm not saying I'm one of them. You'll tell by this video I suck at language. But that's an aside. Probably not. But so an intelligent person has a more complex language, even within our own society, than a less intelligent person, right? So wouldn't it make sense, this is what I would argue, that if an actual group, an actual subpopulation or population of humans, where intelligence was selected against, one of the signatures, one of the stamps of that historical event occurring would be those people would have a simpler language than other people, right? Even if they started off with a more complex language, elements would be lost. We would lose meaning. Words would lose meaning and be discarded. Words would be combined into more generalized meaning. This kind of a thing, right? Does it kind of make sense? So, one way to test the race realist hypothesis would be to look at world languages and let's see if there's any groups on this planet with a simple language. Well, it turns out there are none. Every human group on planet Earth has an equally complex language. There are no simple languages. Every human language can express all states of being, all abstract concepts that humans can think of. This is what's kind of confounded the actual studies of the evolution of language. It would be a lot easier if we found some African tribe with a real simple language. We could say, this gives us some insight into maybe how language evolved. But such a thing doesn't exist. The only simple languages on the planet are languages like that are pidgins, that are developed between means of communicating between two different major language groups. Trade languages tend to be simple, that kind of thing. But actual fundamental languages, none of them are simple. So that right there seems to argue against the concept that there's ever been a modern human with less intelligence than any other modern human, if that makes sense. Now, I'm not trying to say that there's, obviously you're not going to find some isolated tribe in Papua New Guinea that has a indigenous word for computer network or something like that. That's not what I'm saying. But I mean, base conceptual things that humans can think of, states of mind that we can think of, emotions, abstract words with historical context, all of those exist with equal complexity in all languages around the world. So right there, I think is pretty good evidence against that. Just my opinion, but I think that's something that you should really think pretty deep about if you're going to be arguing that some human groups have less intelligence than others. Now, a final argument, I think, against the race realist position is in looking at various human groups around the planet. And since we've been doing a lot, genetic testing, looking at genomes has become cheaper, simpler, far more widespread than it ever has been. And because of this, we are learning more and more about the genetic makeup of different groups around the world and looking at this, applying this to things like migration patterns, historical migration patterns, these kinds of issues. And with that, we found that some groups on the planet, some human groups, are more isolated than others. This kind of makes sense, right? People, let's say, living in Western Asia, where everybody migrating back and forth, have a more cosmopolitan genetic background than, say, people living in the Americas or people living in Australia. That makes sense because people that have been more isolated over time. And in looking at that, that should be a great way for us to test the race realist position, right? The human groups that have been more isolated should bear the signature of decreased or increased intelligence more than groups that have been less isolated, right? I mean, one could make the argument that, say, this group living in Egypt were historically genetically stupid. They evolved thousands of years of stupidity, and then the Romans came and fucked intelligence into them, and that's why they're smart today, or something like that. An argument could be made because that group has been mixed, but that wouldn't be the case with a group that was isolated for a very long time, right? Or more isolated than others. Now, I want to make it really clear. This is why what I keep saying, I keep correcting myself because it's just a habit, unfortunately, of talking about human populations, plural, when humanity is one single population. There are no, there may be, you might say, subpopulations, but there are no true separate populations because we don't meet that test of heterozygosity. We simply don't meet that. Humans, even, the Americas to Asia, things like that. There have been exchanges back and forth, Australia and the rest of the Asian continent and things like that. There have been exchanges, even if they've been some less frequent than they were people living on a mainland continent have been, if that makes sense. We looked at, I can't find the paper to save my life, which pisses me off because I really wanted to present part of that here, which was there was I believe it was a neutral gene, part of something to do with immuno thing. Some part of the immune, one of the genes associated with that, but one that's not functioning or not critically important. But it spread through seemingly through genetic drift, and it was, I think they traced its evolution like 2,000 or 3,000 years ago in Europe, and it's been found in Oceania. Basically in a few thousand years, it spread even something not selected for, if that makes sense. So humans have constantly interbred, even if it's been slowly. But sorry, that's a long fucking ramble about this. Sorry, I apologize. But the most isolated human group that we've found, as far as I'm aware of, has been in Papua New Guinea. It appears that the people living in the highlands of Papua New Guinea seem to be more genetically isolated from the rest of humanity than even the Australian Aboriginals, which got a few successive waves of immigration, apparently, their genes show. While people in Papua New Guinea at least in the highlands, were bypassed by these waves of immigrants. So it's really, that would be it. We should be able to look at those people and say, wow, look at that. They're not as smart as the rest of humanity. They have this genetic thing that makes them not as smart as humanity. But then there's this, and I know it's argument from anecdote, and I'm not saying that this is, just proves, but to me, this sort of stands as, let's just say, at the best case, doesn't support the race realist concept. Is like a guy named Augustine Mungkaje. I don't know, probably never heard of him. He's a evolutionary ecologist, studies reef biology. What makes him fascinating to me, first of all, his dissertation is in temperate coastal and shrimp ecology, which is exactly what my PhD work, which I didn't complete, but my PhD research was in. We worked with different coasts, but the same general concept in our dissertations, which is pretty nifty. But what makes him really interesting to me is that this guy, his grandmother was literally born into the Stone Age. Okay, this is a person whose genetics are the most isolated group on the planet. They weren't discovered until like the 1930s, discovered by the West into the 1930s. Had little isolation even with other groups. They were unknown by even other Papua New Guinea groups. And yet 3 generations later, this guy is a professor of evolutionary biology and ecology. He runs a research station, a field station. He's presented papers. He's got a huge, extensive resume. If I think about it, I'll put his CV down below. He's got this extensive publication record. He's by every single measure a brilliant scientist. in my field, in marine biology and decapod ecology and fisheries ecology. And yet he shouldn't exist, is my argument. If based on this kind of idea, for thousands of years his people remained genetically isolated, using stone tools to chip out yam gardens, at some isolated place in Papua New Guinea, right? How much intelligence does that take? Did a genetic change happen? No. It's more likely that the conditions that enabled his ancestors to survive there, that concepts of the abstract, that brain power, that language, all of those things that helped his ancestors survive are the same characteristics that all of us carry. Okay, not that all of us are equally intelligent, but all of us carry those characteristics. The same characteristics that enable us to put a man on the moon, that enable us to do all of the things that modern humans do, all that modern human civilization has accomplished. Those same characteristics help those in these looks to us to be simple conditions. Those language skills, the artistic abilities, the ability to remember your past, the ability to plan for the future, all of those concepts in modern humans are the same, have the same selection pressures, the same things to maintain them in a diverse and wide variety of habitats. And as far as I'm aware, there's none of that has ever selected against that. In fact, it seems to me that the opposites occurred, if that makes sense. So anyway, I'm not going to promise, but I have a few other points I want to cover, but this is getting long. But I don't feel guilty about going on and making another creationist video series or something like that, leaving this one undone now. I might do a part 3 on this. I might not. We'll see how it goes. But I'm going to end this now. I hope I made some kind of sense somewhere in all of this, that there was a grain of something important to somebody. I don't know. So anyway, talk to you later.